She arrived with Shakespeare tucked into her suitcase and mathematics in her mind. He needed a mother for his child, not a woman who could quote sonnets and solve equations. But sometimes, what we reject is exactly what we need. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Boston Public Library stood like a cathedral of knowledge, its marble corridors echoing with whispered conversations and the gentle rustling of pages. Eleanor Mitchell moved silently through the West Wing, her fingers trailing along leather-bound spines as she searched for a particular volume on advanced mathematics. At 31, she had long since accepted that her life would be defined by books rather than marriage, not that she minded most days. Miss Mitchell, Mrs. Caldwell, the head librarian, appeared at the end of the aisle. "There you are. Your father sent word he's waiting outside." Eleanor nodded, reluctantly abandoning her search. Her father, a professor of literature at the Women's College, had always encouraged her education. He believed in her mind when suitors had found it intimidating. "Tell him I'll be right there." Outside, autumn leaves skittered across the cobblestone street. Her father's carriage waited, its black lacquer gleaming in the afternoon light. Professor Mitchell sat upright, his silver-streaked beard neatly trimmed, eyes focused on an open newspaper. "Father," Eleanor greeted him, climbing into the carriage, "I didn't expect you today." He folded the newspaper slowly, deliberately. "Your mother's condition has worsened. The doctor says—" He paused, voice catching. "She may not have much time left." Eleanor's world tilted. Her mother's illness had been a constant shadow for years, but somehow she'd never truly believed the end would come. Now, facing that reality, she felt both numb and painfully aware of all the things left unsaid. At home, her mother lay pale against white pillows, breathing shallow. The scent of medicinal herbs hung heavy in the air. Eleanor sat by her bedside through the night, reading aloud from favorite books until her voice grew hoarse. As dawn broke, her mother's eyes fluttered open. "Eleanor," she whispered, "promise me you won't spend your life waiting." "I'm not waiting, Mother," Eleanor insisted, clutching her hand. "I'm learning, teaching, but not living," her mother interrupted. With surprising strength, "There's a world beyond these brick walls and leather books. Find it." Her eyes drifted closed again, and 3 days later she was gone. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by colleagues and former students, but few friends. Eleanor realized how small their circle had become, how academia had become both sanctuary and prison. As mourners departed, she found herself standing alone in the parlor, surrounded by condolence cards and wilting flowers. "She worried about you," her father said, entering the room with a glass of port. "We both have." Eleanor bristled. "I've hardly been a burden." "No," he agreed, "but you've been contained. Your mother feared you'd never risk your heart again after James left." The name still pained her, though the engagement had ended 5 years ago. James had admired her intellect when they met at a university lecture. He'd called her refreshingly different, until different became difficult, and he'd chosen a more conventional bride. "What would you have me do? Pretend to be less than I am to catch a husband?" Her father sighed. "I'd have you be exactly who you are, but perhaps somewhere your gifts might be valued rather than feared." 2 weeks later, he placed a newspaper before her at breakfast. The page was folded to display a column of advertisements. "Schoolmaster in Colorado mining town seeking educated bride." Eleanor read aloud. "Must be capable of assisting with lessons and raising 10-year-old daughter. Respectability and fondness for learning essential." She looked up, incredulous. "A mail-order bride advertisement? Surely you're not serious." Her father's expression remained steady. "The man is a widower named Thomas Grant. I've made inquiries. He's respected in Pine Ridge, serves as the town's only teacher. His credentials are genuine, educated at Dartmouth. And he's advertising for a wife like one might advertise for a housekeeper. He's seeking a partner, Eleanor, someone who shares his values." Eleanor pushed the paper away. "I've no interest in being anyone's purchased bride." Yet that night, she found herself staring at the advertisement again. What awaited her in Boston? Years of tutoring wealthy girls who would abandon their studies once married, watching her. Father age alone in their too large house. The words fondness for learning lingered in her mind. At least this schoolmaster might appreciate her mind rather than fear it. Her letter was straightforward, betraying none of her apprehension. "Mr. Grant, I am responding to your advertisement seeking an educated bride. I am 31 years old, unmarried, and have served as a mathematics and literature tutor for the past decade. I hold a degree from Mount Holyoke College and speak both French and Latin. I have experience with children as both tutor and aunt to my brother's 3 children. If you believe I might be suitable as both assistant and wife, I await your correspondence." She signed it simply, Eleanor Mitchell, and sent it west before she could reconsider. His response came 3 weeks later, the handwriting precise, and measured, "Miss Mitchell, your credentials are impressive, perhaps unusually so. I seek a mother for my daughter Sophie and help with younger students. While your academic achievements are admirable, I wonder if you might find our small town lacking in intellectual stimulation. Nevertheless, I am enclosing funds for your journey should you decide to proceed. We can evaluate our compatibility in person. Respectfully, Thomas Grant." Eleanor read between the lines. He was hesitant. Her education made him wary, but curious enough to proceed. She should have been offended. Instead, she found herself packing her trunks. Margaret Wilson, her closest friend and fellow teacher, was appalled. "You're abandoning everything on the strength of a few stilted sentences? This isn't like you." "Eleanor, perhaps that's precisely why I must go," Eleanor replied, carefully wrapping her mother's silver hand mirror. "I've been exactly like me for 31 years, and where has it led? To empty rooms and borrowed children." Margaret's expression softened. "You're grieving. This isn't the time for such decisions." "On the contrary," Eleanor countered, "grief has shown me how quickly time passes. My mother was right. I've been waiting. For what? I'm not certain, but I know it isn't here." The night before her departure, her father presented her with a small leather-bound volume. "Your mother would want you to have this." It was her mother's journal, filled with observations about plants, sketches of birds, and quiet reflections on a life she'd found beautiful, despite its limitations. "She saw wonder in ordinary things," her father said. "Perhaps that's what she wanted for you, not grand adventures, but eyes open to the beauty of whatever life offers." Eleanor tucked the journal into her suitcase alongside her books of poetry, mathematics, and natural philosophy. Whatever awaited in Colorado, she would face it with her mind intact and her mother's spirit close. The journey west was a revelation. Boston's crowded streets gave way to open plains that stretched toward distant mountains. The train pressed onward through territories she'd only read about in books. She observed fellow passengers, farmers, merchants, and other mail-order brides, younger and more conventional than herself, and wondered if any of them felt this strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. Pine Ridge emerged from the landscape like an afterthought, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, backed by soaring pines and the distant peaks of the Rockies. Eleanor stepped onto the platform, gripping her valise tightly, scanning the small crowd for the schoolmaster who might become her husband. She recognized him immediately. Thomas Grant stood apart from the others, tall and serious, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, his features too stark, his frame too lean, but there was something compelling about his stillness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Beside him, partially hidden, stood a girl with a braid the color of wheat and eyes that watched everything. Eleanor approached them directly, extending her hand. "Mr. Grant, I'm Eleanor Mitchell." His grip was firm but brief. "Miss Mitchell, welcome to Pine Ridge." His eyes took her measure, lingering on the book visible in her open valise, a volume of advanced calculus. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps disappointment. "This is my daughter, Sophie." The girl didn't offer her hand or smile, simply nodded with the same gravity as her father. "You brought a lot of books," she observed. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "Books are old friends. I couldn't leave them behind." Thomas cleared his throat. "We should proceed to the house. You must be tired from your journey." The schoolmaster's wagon was utilitarian, the wooden bench hard against Eleanor's travel-weary body. They proceeded, in silence, through the town's main street, past a general store, a small church, and what appeared to be a newly constructed bank. People turned to watch them pass, curiosity evident in their stares. "The schoolhouse is adjacent to our home," Thomas explained as they left the town proper. "It's convenient for my work, though perhaps isolating at times." Eleanor nodded, taking in the landscape, so different from Boston's manicured gardens and crowded streets. Here, nature ruled, wild grasses, towering pines, and a sky so vast it seemed impossible. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Raw, but beautiful." Thomas glanced at her, something like surprise in his expression. "Most Easterners find it primitive." "I'm not most Easterners," Eleanor replied. Then softening her tone, "Beauty exists in many forms, Mr. Grant. I've found that the most honest forms are rarely the most refined." His home appeared around a bend, a modest two-story structure painted white with green shutters. Beside it stood the schoolhouse, a single-room building with a small bell tower. Thomas helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her more than necessary. "Sophie will show you to your room. I've lessons to prepare for tomorrow." And with that, he was gone, striding toward the schoolhouse without a backward glance. Sophie regarded Eleanor with unconcealed curiosity. "Father says you're very educated." "I've had opportunities to learn, yes." "He says you might be too educated." Eleanor couldn't suppress a smile. "Is there such a thing?" Sophie considered this seriously. "Father says knowledge is valuable, but wisdom more so." She lifted one of Eleanor's smaller bags. "Your room is this way. It was my mother's sewing room before." The room was small but neat, with a single window overlooking the schoolyard. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a small writing desk comprised the furnishings. On the wall hung a simple watercolor of mountain wildflowers, the brushwork delicate and precise. "Did your mother paint this?" Eleanor asked. Sophie nodded. "She liked to paint when she wasn't teaching. Father doesn't talk about her much." "And when did she pass away?" 2 years ago. Influenza." Sophie's matter-of-fact tone couldn't hide the shadow that passed over her young face. "Will you be teaching with Father now?" "That remains to be seen," Eleanor replied carefully. "For now, I'm just visiting to determine if this would be a good place for me." "You mean if you want to marry Father?" Eleanor blinked at the child's directness. "Yes, and if he wants to marry me." Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied with this honesty. "Dinner's at 6. Father doesn't like tardiness." She paused at the door. "He doesn't think you'll stay. He says Boston ladies don't last in places like Pine Ridge." Before Eleanor could respond, Sophie was gone, leaving her alone with her unpacked trunks and an unexpected challenge. "So, the Schoolmaster believed she would fail? That her education made her unsuitable for frontier life? Well then, perhaps Thomas Grant needed an education of his own. Dinner was a quiet affair, roast chicken, potatoes and green beans, all prepared by Sophie with surprising competence. Thomas ate methodically, his attention seemingly focused on his plate rather than his guests. "The schoolhouse has 27 students," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Ages ranging from 6 to 16. I handle the older students. My assistant, Mrs. Cooper, handles the younger ones. She's recently announced her intention to move east with her son, which is why He cleared his throat. "Which is why additional help would be beneficial." "And what subjects do you teach, Mr. Grant?" Eleanor asked. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history and basic sciences. Some Latin for the older students." Eleanor nodded. "I could certainly assist with those. I've also taught geometry, algebra, literature and natural philosophy." Thomas's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Our curriculum is necessarily practical, Miss Mitchell. Most students here won't proceed to university. They'll work family farms or businesses." "Education is never wasted, Mr. Grant," Eleanor replied quietly. "Even for those who plough fields or tend shops." He set down his fork. "Perhaps not wasted, but it can be impractical, especially for girls in a place like this." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Are you suggesting that Sophie shouldn't receive a thorough education because of her gender or location?" Thomas's gaze snapped to hers, sharp with surprise. "I did not say that, but you implied it." Sophie looked between them, suddenly alert to the tension. "I merely suggested that education should be suited to its purpose," Thomas said carefully. "Sophie will receive every advantage I can provide, including mathematics beyond arithmetic, literature beyond basic primers, science beyond naming plants and animals. If she shows interest and aptitude, yes." Eleanor took a measured breath. "And if I were to become your wife, would you expect me to set aside my own interests and aptitude?" The directness of her question clearly startled him. Sophie sat perfectly, still watching. "I would expect you to fulfill the duties you agreed to," he said after a long pause, "as I fulfill mine. And those duties would include assisting with the school, maintaining our home, providing Sophie with guidance and care," he hesitated, "being a suitable partner. And would discussing calculus or reading Shakespeare make me unsuitable?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Miss Mitchell, I fear you misunderstand me." "Then enlighten me, Mr. Grant. Because from where I sit, it appears you advertised for an educated woman only to be dismayed when one actually arrived." Sophie's eyes widened. Thomas set his napkin beside his plate with deliberate care. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion when we're not at the dinner table," he suggested, voice tight. "Sophie, please clear the dishes." The girl obeyed quickly, darting meaningful glances at Eleanor as she gathered the plates. When she had left for the kitchen, Thomas leaned forward. "Miss Mitchell, I appreciate your forthrightness, but you might consider that there are complexities you don't yet understand." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that the last teacher who preceded Mrs. Cooper left after 3 months because she couldn't adapt to life here. Such as the fact that my daughter has lost one mother already and needn't become attached to another, who will soon depart. Such as the fact that this town values tradition, and while I personally respect your accomplishments, others might view them, and by extension our potential union, with suspicion." Eleanor absorbed this, recognizing the legitimate concerns beneath his defensive tone. "I understand those considerations, Mr. Grant, but you should know that I didn't travel thousands of miles on a whim. I came because I believed there might be a place here for all of who I am, not just the parts convenient to traditional expectations." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes. I respect your conviction, Miss Mitchell, but conviction alone doesn't heat a house in winter or comfort a child who wakes from nightmares. No, she agreed, but it does provide the strength to learn what one doesn't yet know. He studied her face as if seeing her properly for the first time. We shall see, Miss Mitchell. In the meantime, I invite you to observe my classes tomorrow. That might give you a clearer picture of what we're discussing. With that, he stood and excused himself, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the fading warmth of the kitchen stove. Later, as she prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. Sophie stood in the hallway, a small book clutched to her chest. "Father said I should bring you this," she explained, extending the book. "It's information about Pine Ridge and the school." "Thank you, Sophie." Eleanor accepted the book, then hesitated. "May I ask you something?" The girl nodded. "Are you happy with the idea of your father remarrying?" Sophie considered this with a seriousness beyond her years. "I don't remember much about my mother anymore. Just that she laughed a lot and told good stories. Father doesn't laugh now," she shrugged. "Maybe he would laugh again with a new wife. Maybe not." Eleanor's heart ached for this solemn child. "And what about you? What would make you happy?" Sophie's eyes widened slightly, as if no one had asked her this before. "I like drawing," she said finally. "And stars. Father showed me constellations last summer, but he's been too busy this year." "Perhaps we could look at stars together sometime," Eleanor suggested. "I'm not an expert, but I've studied basic astronomy." Something like hope flickered in Sophie's expression. "Really? Really? Knowledge is meant to be shared, don't you think?" Sophie nodded. "Father says that too, but..." She trailed off. "But what?" "But he keeps lots of things to himself anyway." With that cryptic observation, she wished Eleanor good night and disappeared down the hall. Eleanor opened the book Sophie had delivered. It contained practical information about the town's history, the school's schedule, and local customs. But inserted between the pages was something unexpected, a pressed wildflower, and a small note in Thomas's precise handwriting. "Miss Mitchell, I apologize if my reception seemed cold. Caution has become habit. Whatever comes of our arrangement, I hope you will find some beauty in Pine Ridge. This columbine grows on the ridge behind the schoolhouse each spring. Perhaps by then, we will better understand one another." Eleanor touched the delicate purple petals, surprised by this small gesture of, what? Not exactly welcome, but perhaps openness to possibility. She placed the flower carefully in her mother's journal before extinguishing her lamp. Outside her window, the Colorado sky revealed stars in numbers she'd never imagined possible, scattered across the darkness like mathematical equations waiting to be understood. Eleanor Mitchell, who had lived her life by books and reason, found herself wondering if perhaps there were forms of knowledge that couldn't be contained between leather covers. Forms that might only be discovered by stepping into the unknown, with eyes and heart wide open. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the small window of Eleanor's room. For a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, she felt a wave of panic. Then reality settled around her. The wooden walls, the distant sound of a rooster crowing, the scent of pine drifting through the partially open window. She was in Colorado, hundreds of miles from the brick and cobblestone streets of Boston, in the home of a man who might become her husband. Eleanor dressed methodically, choosing her simplest blouse and skirt. Her wardrobe, selected for a Boston tutor's life, suddenly seemed impractical, too formal, too restrictive. She pinned her chestnut hair in a modest style and studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. At 31, she was no longer young by society's standards, the fine lines around her eyes testament to years spent reading in poor light. Yet something in her face looked different this morning, perhaps more determined or simply more awake. Downstairs, she found Sophie alone in the kitchen, expertly flipping cornmeal pancakes on a cast-iron griddle. "Good morning," Eleanor greeted her. "May I help?" Sophie regarded her with cautious curiosity. "Father's already at the schoolhouse. He rises before dawn. The coffee's ready, though." Eleanor poured herself a cup, noting the girl's competence. "You manage very well in the kitchen for someone your age." "Had to learn," Sophie said simply, transferring the pancakes to a plate. "Mrs. Cooper helps sometimes, but mostly it's me now." "And before that?" "Father tried." A small smile flickered across Sophie's face. "He burned almost everything, even porridge." Eleanor returned the smile, sensing an opening. "Perhaps we could cook together while I'm here. I'm not an expert, but I can manage without setting in things ablaze." Sophie seemed to consider this offer, her expression serious beyond her years. "Do you know how to make apple dumplings? Mother used to make them in autumn." "I don't," Eleanor admitted, "but I'm quite good at following recipes. Perhaps you remember how she made them?" Something closed in Sophie's face. "No, I don't remember much." Eleanor recognized the defense mechanism, the deliberate forgetting that sometimes follows loss. She'd seen it in her students, in herself after disappointments. "Memory is curious that way," she said gently. "Sometimes it hides things from us, only to return them when we least expect it." Sophie shrugged, placing the plate of pancakes on the table. "We should eat. Father doesn't like when I'm late for school." They ate quickly, the silence broken only by the occasional clink of forks against plates. As they finished, Eleanor gathered the dishes. "You go ahead to school. I'll wash these and join you shortly." Sophie hesitated. "Are you sure? Most ladies don't like washing up." "I'm not most ladies," Eleanor replied with a wink. "Besides, I've washed plenty of dishes in my life." After Sophie departed, Eleanor made quick work of the breakfast dishes, then consulted the small map of Pine Ridge included in the information book Thomas had provided. The walk to the schoolhouse was short, just across the yard and down a gentle slope. As she approached, she heard the unified voices of children reciting multiplication tables. Eleanor paused at the doorway, taking in the scene. The schoolroom was larger than she'd expected, with windows along both sides providing ample light. Rows of wooden desks faced a larger desk at the front, behind which Thomas stood, pointer in hand, directing the mathematical recitation. Children of various ages filled the desks, their attention focused on their teacher with varying degrees of interest. Thomas noticed her immediately, though his rhythm never faltered. He nodded slightly, indicating she should enter. Eleanor slipped into an empty chair at the back of the room, observing his teaching method with professional interest. He was competent, certainly. His explanations were clear, his manner authoritative, without being intimidating. The students responded well to him, particularly the older boys, who seemed eager to demonstrate their knowledge. Yet Eleanor noticed something curious. The girls, especially the older ones, participated less frequently. They answered when called upon, but rarely volunteered. As the morning progressed through reading lessons for the younger children and grammar for the older ones, Eleanor found herself mentally noting teaching approaches she might have handled differently. Not because Thomas's methods were poor, but because they seemed to address only certain types of learners, those who absorbed information through repetition and direct instruction. At midday break, the children spilled outside with pent-up energy, leaving Eleanor and Thomas alone in the schoolroom. He approached her seat, hands clasped behind his back, in what she was beginning to recognize as a characteristic pose. "Your impressions, Miss Mitchell?" His tone was professional, almost challenging. Eleanor chose her words carefully. "You're clearly an experienced teacher. The children respect you. But," He raised an eyebrow, sensing her reservation. But I notice the girls participate less actively than the boys, particularly in mathematics. And some of the quieter children seem to struggle with the recitation method. Thomas's expression tightened. Our resources are limited, Miss Mitchell. Group recitation efficiently covers necessary material. Efficiency isn't always effectiveness, Eleanor countered gently. Different minds learn in different ways. A luxury perspective from someone accustomed to tutoring 1 or 2 students at a time. There was no malice in his voice, merely statement of fact. Here, I must educate 27 children of varying ages and abilities alone since Mrs. Cooper's departure. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the challenge. Where is Mrs. Cooper today? I understood she hasn't yet departed. Her son took ill yesterday. She sent word this morning she wouldn't be in. Thomas glanced toward the window where the younger children played. Which means I must somehow manage both age groups this afternoon. Eleanor seized the opportunity. I could assist with the younger children, reading and basic arithmetic, I presume. Thomas studied her, doubt evident in his expression. These aren't the refined children of Boston society, Miss Mitchell. Many come from mining or farming families. Some arrive unwashed, others haven't eaten since yesterday's lunch. Children are children, Mr. Grant. Their circumstances may differ, but their capacity to learn remains. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Unless you don't believe me capable. A subtle shift occurred in his demeanor, a reluctant acknowledgement. Very well. You may take the primer group this afternoon. 6 children, ages 6 through 8, basic reading and numbers. Eleanor spent the lunch hour reviewing the primers and materials available for the younger students. The texts were standard and somewhat outdated but serviceable. As the children returned, Thomas directed the 6 youngest to the far corner of the room where Eleanor waited. The children regarded her with open curiosity. 2 boys with identical freckled faces, twins clearly, whispered to each other behind their hands. A small girl with braided dark hair stared solemnly at Eleanor's boots. Another girl, blonde and fidgety, kept glancing toward the older students as if wishing to join them. Good afternoon, Eleanor greeted them warmly. I'm Miss Mitchell. I'll be working with you today. Are you the new teacher? One of the twins asked bluntly. I'm visiting Mr. Grant and helping in the school for now, Eleanor explained. Pa says you're from back east and might marry the schoolmaster, the second twin announced loudly enough that several older students turned to look. Eleanor noticed Thomas's shoulders stiffen, though he didn't turn around. I see news travels. Quickly in Pine Ridge, she replied calmly. Now, shall we begin with reading? Please open your primers to page 12. The afternoon progressed better than Eleanor had anticipated. The younger children, initially wary, responded enthusiastically to her approach. Instead of pure recitation, she incorporated elements of play, having them act out words, engage in counting games, and take turns teaching each other. The quiet girl, Martha, proved to have a quick mind for numbers, while the fidgety blonde, Emma, revealed an impressive vocabulary. Occasionally, Eleanor felt Thomas's gaze on her, evaluating her methods. She didn't alter her approach to please him. These were techniques she'd refined over years of teaching, adapting classical education to make it accessible and engaging. By day's end, the younger children were reluctant to leave her corner of the classroom. Martha, who had barely spoken at the beginning of the session, tugged at Eleanor's sleeve before departing. Will you teach us again tomorrow, Miss Mitchell? She asked in a near whisper. Eleanor glanced toward Thomas, who was gathering papers at his desk, his expression unreadable. That depends on Mr. Grant, she answered honestly. As the last students filed out, Thomas approached Eleanor's teaching area, surveying the evidence of the afternoon's activities, drawings illustrating vocabulary words, pebbles arranged in counting patterns, a crude map of the classroom the children had created. As a geography exercise. Unconventional methods, he remarked. But effective ones, Eleanor replied. Martha counted to 100 today, though you mentioned she's been resistant to mathematics. She's painfully shy. Her father works double shifts at the mine. Her mother takes in washing. There's little time for education at home. Eleanor nodded. Yet she has an affinity for patterns. This is remarkable work. The precision of these angles, the calculation involved. Father says I could learn when my hands are bigger, Sophie said, a note of longing in her voice. But I'm afraid I'll forget how she did it before then. Eleanor studied the girl's face, recognizing the fear behind her words, not just of forgetting the quilting technique, but of losing one more connection to her mother. Perhaps we could document the patterns, she suggested. Create a book of your mother's designs with measurements and instructions for each. Sophie's eyes widened. Could we? Father doesn't come in here much. With your father's permission, of course. But yes, we could create a proper record, a legacy of your mother's artistry and mathematical skill. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Eleanor found Thomas in his study, grading student compositions by lamplight. She knocked softly on the half-open door. Mr. Grant, might I speak with you a moment? He looked up, removing the reading, glasses that lent him a scholarly appearance. Of course. Please come in. Eleanor entered the book-lined room, immediately noting that the largest collection appeared to be mathematical and scientific texts. Not just basic works, but advanced treatises she recognized from her father's library. Interesting. Sophie showed me her mother's quilting room, she began. The work there is extraordinary. The mathematical precision, the creative vision. Thomas's expression softened at the mention of his late wife's work. Anna had a natural gift. She could envision patterns complete in her mind before setting a single stitch. Sophie fears losing that connection to her mother, Eleanor continued gently. I've suggested we might document the patterns and techniques, create a book of her mother's designs that Sophie could learn from when she's ready. She expected resistance, perhaps defensiveness at her intervention in this private family matter. Instead, Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the student papers before him. I've avoided that room, he admitted finally. It was her space, her world. I lack the knowledge to preserve what she created there. But Sophie needs that preservation, Eleanor said softly. Not just the quilts themselves, but the understanding of how they were created, the mathematics behind the beauty. Thomas looked up, a vulnerability in his expression she hadn't seen before. And you could help with this? I understand the geometric principles, yes. With Sophie's help in remembering her mother's methods, we could create something meaningful, something that honors Anna's gifts while passing them to her daughter. He studied her face as if seeing something new there. You truly believe in the importance of this. I believe in preserving knowledge, Mr. Grant, especially knowledge born of love and artistic vision. Eleanor paused, then added, and I believe Sophie needs tangible connections to her mother, more than memories, which fade, but something she can hold and learn from. Thomas nodded slowly. Then you have my permission, and my gratitude. He hesitated, then added, Anna would have appreciated your understanding of her work. Most saw only pretty blankets. While she saw living mathematics, Eleanor finished for him, a language few recognized she was speaking. Yes. The single word carried weight, acknowledgement of a shared understanding. Eleanor turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Mr. Grant, those texts on non-Euclidean geometry, are they part of your teaching curriculum? Surprise flickered across his features. No. Personal interest only. A rather advanced personal interest for a small town. Schoolmaster. A faint smile touched his lips. We all contain multitudes, Miss Mitchell. Indeed we do, Mr. Grant. Good night. The days that followed established a rhythm. Mornings in the classroom, Eleanor working with the younger children while Thomas taught the older students. Afternoons spent with Sophie in the quilting room, carefully documenting Anna Grant's designs, measuring and diagramming the mathematical principles underlying each pattern. Evenings often found Eleanor in conversation with Thomas about the days, lessons, or quietly reading while he graded papers. The town's curiosity about her presence was evident. On Saturday morning, when Thomas took her to the general store to purchase school supplies, conversations hushed as they entered, only to resume in whispers as they moved through the aisles. "Miss Mitchell, how lovely to meet you properly." Plump woman in a floral dress approached them, smiling broadly. "I'm Harriet Wilson, head of the Ladies' Aid Society. We've all been so curious about Mr. Grant's visitor from Boston." Eleanor returned the greeting politely, aware of Thomas stiffening beside her. "Miss Mitchell has been assisting in the school while Mrs. Cooper tends to her son," he explained, with formal courtesy. "How fortunate," Mrs. Wilson replied, her eyes sparkling with undisguised interest. "And will you be staying in Pine Ridge long, Miss Mitchell?" Before Eleanor could answer, another woman joined them, taller, elegantly dressed despite the frontier setting, with sharp features and sharper eyes. "Harriet, don't pester the poor woman. Mr. Grant's arrangements are hardly our business." She extended a gloved hand to Eleanor. "Beatrice Montgomery. My husband manages the bank." Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Montgomery," Eleanor replied, noting the assessing look in the woman's eyes. "Miss Mitchell taught at a women's college back east, I understand," Mrs. Montgomery continued, glancing at Thomas. "How progressive. Though one wonders what practical use such advanced education serves in a place like Pine Ridge." There it was, the first direct challenge, delicately wrapped in social niceties. Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her, preparing to intervene. But she spoke first. "Education serves the same purpose everywhere, Mrs. Montgomery, to awaken minds to possibility. Whether one calculates banking interest or measures flour for bread, understanding the underlying principles enriches the task." Mrs. Montgomery's eyebrows rose. "Well articulated, though I imagine most miners' children will have little use for philosophy or Latin declensions." "On the contrary," Eleanor replied evenly. "Clear thinking and precise language benefit everyone, regardless of occupation. The child who understands why numbers behave as they do will manage accounts better than one who merely memorizes tables." Mrs. Wilson nodded enthusiastically. "So true. My Henry struggled terribly with figures until Mr. Grant explained the reasoning behind the operations. Now he keeps all our shop records." The conversation continued, with Mrs. Montgomery probing Eleanor's background and Mrs. Wilson enthusing about the school's improvement under Thomas's leadership. Through it all, Eleanor maintained gracious composure, neither apologizing for her education nor flaunting it. As they finally extricated themselves with purchases in hand, Thomas guided her toward the wagon with a light touch at her elbow. "You handled that admirably," he said quietly. "Mrs. Montgomery can be formidable." "She was testing boundaries," Eleanor observed. "Understandable, given the circumstances." The circumstances. A stranger arrives from the east, potentially, to marry the town's schoolmaster and help raise his daughter. Of course they're curious, and some protective. Thomas assisted her into the wagon, his expression thoughtful. "You're surprisingly understanding of small-town scrutiny." People are people, Mr. Grant, whether in Boston drawing rooms or Colorado general stores. Social dynamics differ in details, but not in essence. He climbed up beside her, taking the reins. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Mitchell." "Is that a favorable development?" she asked, genuinely curious. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I believe it might be." That evening, As Eleanor sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and rose, Sophie emerged from the house with her sketchbook. "May I join you?" the girl asked with uncharacteristic shyness. "Of course. I'd welcome the company." Sophie settled beside her on the wooden bench, opening her sketchbook to a fresh page. "I'm drawing the sunset colors. Father says they're different here than other places because of the altitude and dust in the air." "Your father knows a great deal about natural phenomena," Eleanor observed. "He has quite the collection of scientific texts." Sophie nodded, selecting a yellow pencil from her small case. He wanted to study astronomy at university, but his father got sick, so he had to teach instead. Eleanor absorbed this new information about Thomas, another layer to the man who presented himself as a simple schoolmaster. "Do you enjoy science as well?" "I like stars," Sophie replied, carefully shading her drawing. "And animals. Father takes me collecting specimens sometimes, butterflies and interesting rocks. Mother used to press flowers and label them with their scientific names." "It sounds like both your parents valued learning." Sophie nodded, absorbed in her drawing. After several minutes of companionable silence, she spoke again. "Are you going to marry Father?" The directness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. "That hasn't been decided yet, Sophie. We're still becoming acquainted. But you might, if you decided you liked it here." Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "If your father and I determine we would suit each other, and if you were comfortable with the arrangement, then yes, that possibility exists." Sophie concentrated on her drawing, adding touches of orange to the sky. "I wouldn't mind," she said finally, "if you stayed. You explain things differently than Father. He gets impatient sometimes when I don't understand right away." "Everyone learns differently," Eleanor replied. "It doesn't mean you're not understanding, just that you're taking a different path to knowledge. That's what Mother used to say." Sophie looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly. "Father was happier when she was here. He laughed more." "Grief changes people," Eleanor said gently. "It takes time to find joy again." "But it's been 2 years." Sophie's voice held a note of frustration. "Sometimes I think he's forgotten how." Eleanor had no ready answer for this. She simply placed her hand lightly on Sophie's shoulder, offering silent companionship as the girl returned to her drawing. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The conversation with the girl had stirred something in her, both concern for this solemn child and growing awareness of the complexity of the situation she had entered. Thomas Grant was not simply looking for a wife and mother for his daughter. He was a man divided between his intellectual aspirations and practical responsibilities, between his lingering grief and duty to the living. And she? What was she truly seeking in this remote town? A purpose beyond Boston drawing rooms, certainly, but also, perhaps, connection that valued all of who she was. Not despite her mind, but because of it. Eleanor slipped from her bed and wrapped herself in a shawl. Perhaps a brief walk in the night air would clear her thoughts. She moved quietly down the stairs and onto the porch, only to find Thomas already there, seated in darkness, a small telescope positioned on the railing. "I apologize," she said, startled. "I didn't mean to intrude." He turned, equally surprised by her presence. "You aren't intruding. I often observe the night sky when sleep proves elusive." Eleanor hesitated, then moved closer to see what he was viewing. "Saturn," he explained, adjusting the instrument slightly. "Would you care to look?" She accepted the invitation, bending to place her eye to the eyepiece. The planet hung suspended in the black void, its rings clearly visible despite the telescope's modest power. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "The most elegant demonstration of celestial mechanics visible to the amateur astronomer." Thomas agreed, his voice warming with genuine enthusiasm. The ancients were baffled by its appearance, but Johannes Kepler theorized the true nature of the rings centuries before better instruments confirmed his mathematics. The triumph of calculation over limited observation, Eleanor remarked, straightening to look at him. In the moonlight, his features seemed less severe, animated by intellectual passion rather than duty. Sophie mentioned you had aspired to study astronomy formally. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Sophie tends to share family history rather freely with you. Children often sense when adults are truly interested in their thoughts. Eleanor wrapped her shawl more tightly against the night chill. Were circumstances different? Would you have pursued astronomy rather than teaching? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the stars. Perhaps, but circumstances are rarely different than what they are. My father's illness, my responsibility to the family business, later my marriage to Anna, and her desire to remain near her family here. He shrugged slightly. Life charts its own course, regardless of our celestial aspirations. Yet you continue to study, to observe. Some passions don't die simply because they're impractical. He glanced at her. I imagine you understand that predicament. Eleanor nodded, thinking of her own mathematical studies, pursued despite limited practical application in a woman's traditional sphere. We contain multitudes, as you said. And you, Miss Mitchell, what aspirations have you set aside in deference to circumstance? The personal question surprised her, especially from this reserved man who had maintained such careful boundaries. I once hoped to teach at the university level, mathematics specifically, but such positions are rarely open to women, even those with suitable qualifications. So you tutored instead, and found satisfaction in it, she acknowledged, though sometimes I wondered if my students truly valued what I offered or merely tolerated the lessons to please their parents. A familiar question for any teacher, Thomas remarked with unexpected empathy. We plant seeds without knowing which will take root. They stood in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. The night was clear, the Milky Way a luminous river across the black sky. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Thomas's presence beside her, not as the reserved schoolmaster, but as a man of depth and complexity. You mentioned your telescope is modest, she said finally. Have you used more powerful instruments? Once, at the university in Denver, before Sophie was born. Anna and I traveled there for a teaching conference. The astronomy professor allowed visitors to view through their refractor telescope. His voice softened with recollection. We saw Jupiter's cloud bands, the Orion Nebula. Anna was enchanted. She'd never imagined such sights existed. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. For the first time, he spoke of his late wife without evident pain, only fond remembrance. Curious about everything, though her formal education was limited. She would have appreciated your approach with the younger students today, the way you engaged their different strengths. The compliment, unexpected and genuine, warmed Eleanor more than it should have. Thank you. That means a great deal coming from an experienced teacher. Thomas turned from the telescope to face her directly. In the moonlight, his expression was open, unguarded. Miss Mitchell, Eleanor, if I may, I owe you an apology. I've been unfair in my judgment, allowing past disappointments to color my perception of your intentions and abilities. The use of her given name, the candid acknowledgement, both caught her by surprise. I understand caution, Mr. Grant. You have your daughter to consider, your position in the community. Thomas, he corrected gently, if we are to truly know whether we might suit, we should at least address each other as friends. Thomas, then. His name felt intimate on her lips, a small but significant boundary crossed. He studied her face in the silvery light. You've surprised me at every turn. Not just with your knowledge, but with your adaptability, your genuine interest in Sophie, your understanding of this community despite its differences from your own. People are fundamentally the same everywhere, Eleanor replied. We all seek purpose, connection, understanding. Yet you left everything familiar to seek those things here. That requires unusual courage. Eleanor smiled slightly. Or unusual. Desperation. I don't believe that, Thomas said with unexpected firmness. I've seen desperate women arrive in frontier towns. They carry fear in their eyes, relief at any safe harbor. You carry curiosity, determination. You came not running from, but moving toward. His perception was startlingly accurate. Eleanor felt suddenly vulnerable, seen in a way she hadn't expected. Perhaps a bit of both, she admitted. Boston held memories I needed distance from, but I chose Pine Ridge specifically because your advertisement suggested a man who valued education, who might understand a woman who did as well. And have you found such understanding here? The question was quiet, almost tentative. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. I've found possibilities I didn't anticipate, she said finally, including the possibility that first impressions on both sides may require revision. Thomas nodded slowly. Indeed, they may. He glanced back at the telescope, then at the deepening night. It's grown late. We should both seek rest if we're to manage energetic young scholars tomorrow. Of course. Eleanor turned toward the door, then paused. Thank you for sharing Saturn with me. The privilege was mine. His voice was warm in the darkness. Perhaps tomorrow evening, if the sky remains clear, we might observe Jupiter. Its moons are quite visible even with this modest instrument. I'd like that very much. As Eleanor returned to her room, she found her mind filled not with doubts or calculations about her future, but with the image of Thomas Grant's face transformed by intellectual passion and tentative connection. The cautious schoolmaster and the grieving widower were real, but incomplete pictures of the man. Tonight, she had glimpsed something more, the astronomer who still looked to the stars despite earthly constraints. The father who wanted his daughter to have opportunities he had relinquished. The man capable of acknowledging misjudgment and offering a new beginning. For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, Eleanor fell asleep without questioning her decision to come. Whatever uncertainty tomorrow might bring, tonight had offered something precious. The sense that she was beginning to be seen, not for what she represented or what function she might serve, but for who she truly was. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to see Thomas Grant with equal clarity. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, the October sky a perfect azure, unmarred by clouds. Eleanor dressed with particular care in her navy blue dress with the modest lace collar, her most appropriate attire for church. She had attended services the previous Sunday, but as a mere observer, sitting quietly in the back pew. Today felt different. After 2 weeks in Pine Ridge, she was no longer simply a curiosity, but a presence in the community, teaching at the school, shopping at the general store, and increasingly being seen in Thomas's company. As she pinned her hair, Eleanor caught her reflection in the small mirror. She looked different somehow. Her cheeks held more color, her eyes seemed brighter. Perhaps it was the mountain air, or perhaps the sense of purpose she'd found in the classroom and in helping Sophie preserve her mother's legacy. Downstairs, she found Sophie already dressed in her Sunday best, awkwardly attempting to braid her own hair. "Would you like some help with that?" Eleanor offered. Sophie nodded gratefully, turning to allow Eleanor access to her wheat-colored hair. "Father tries, but he doesn't do it right. The ends always come loose." Eleanor worked methodically, dividing and crossing the strands. "My mother taught me a special technique for braids that stay neat all day. Shall I show you?" "Yes, please." Sophie sat still as Eleanor demonstrated the method, explaining each step clearly. "Could you teach me to do it myself?" "Of course. It takes practice, but once you master it, you'll never forget." Eleanor secured the braid with a ribbon, then turned the girl to face the small mirror hanging in the hallway. "There, what do you think?" Sophie examined her reflection, a small smile of satisfaction crossing her face. "It looks like how Mother used to do it." Thomas appeared in the doorway, straightening his tie. He paused, taking in the scene, Eleanor and Sophie before the mirror, the neatly done braid. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, perhaps memory. "You look very nice, Sophie," he said after a moment. "Thank you, Eleanor." The use of her given name, still new between them, brought a subtle warmth to her cheeks. "My pleasure. Sophie has lovely hair. It deserves to be shown to advantage." Thomas cleared his throat. "We should depart soon. Pastor Wilson doesn't appreciate latecomers." The walk to the small white church at the center of town took them past neat cottages and the occasional larger home. Neighbors nodded or called. "Oh, greetings!" Their curious gazes lingering on Eleanor at Thomas's side, Sophie between them. They presented, Eleanor realized, the outward appearance of a family, an observation that brought both discomfort and a strange rightness. Pine Ridge's church was modest but well-maintained, with simple stained glass windows and hard wooden pews. As they entered, Eleanor felt the weight of scrutiny as heads turned and whispers began. Thomas guided them to a pew near the front, traditionally reserved for the schoolmaster's family, a clear statement to the community whether he intended it as such or not. Pastor Wilson, a stout man with a resonant voice and kind eyes, greeted them warmly as the congregation settled. His sermon focused on the parable of talents, the biblical instruction to use one's gifts rather than bury them in fear. Eleanor couldn't help but note the coincidental relevance to her situation, the question of whether her education might find meaningful application in this remote place. "God grants different gifts to each person," the pastor intoned, his gaze sweeping across the congregation. "Some receive scholarly knowledge, others practical wisdom. Some build with hands, others with words. But all gifts are meant to serve, to multiply, to benefit not just the recipient, but the wider community." Eleanor felt Thomas glance at her and wondered if he too recognized the parallel to their ongoing negotiation about the role of education. In this frontier setting, Sophie, sitting between them, paid unusual attention to the sermon, her small brow furrowed in concentration. After the service, congregants gathered outside to socialize in the autumn sunshine. Eleanor found herself surrounded by curious mothers, eager to meet the woman who had temporarily taken over, teaching their youngest children. "Tommy hasn't stopped talking about your counting games, Miss Mitchell," said Mrs. Reynolds' mother to one of the freckled twins. "Says learning numbers is his favorite part of school now." "Martha actually volunteered to help me with the marketing list yesterday," added another woman, her expression one of pleased surprise. "Counted out the change, perfect as you please." Eleanor accepted their compliments graciously, while noting Thomas engaged in what appeared to be a more serious conversation with several men, including Mrs. Montgomery's husband, a distinguished-looking gentleman with silver at his temples. Their glances in her direction suggested she was the topic of discussion. She was about to excuse herself to check on Sophie when Mrs. Montgomery approached, impeccably dressed in a burgundy ensemble that must have been ordered from Denver or beyond. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you're finding our little community hospitable," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Indeed, everyone has been most welcoming," Eleanor replied. "The children especially are a delight to teach." "Yes, I've heard you've introduced some innovative methods." Mrs. Montgomery studied her with calculated assessment. My husband is on the school board, you know. He's quite invested in maintaining appropriate educational standards. The subtle challenge was clear. Eleanor maintained her composure. Educational standards are certainly important, as is adapting methods to serve diverse learning needs. Mrs. Montgomery adjusted her gloves. Mr. Grant has been an excellent schoolmaster, traditional but effective. The town was quite relieved when he agreed to take the position after his poor wife's passing. It provided stability during a difficult time. He's clearly devoted to the school and the children, Eleanor agreed, wondering where this conversation was heading. Indeed, which is why some of us were concerned when he decided to advertise for a bride from back east. Mrs. Montgomery lowered her voice. Between us, Miss Mitchell, small towns can be wary of outside influences, particularly when they affect beloved institutions like our school. I understand community concerns, Eleanor replied carefully. Change can be unsettling, even when ultimately beneficial. Mrs. Montgomery's eyes narrowed slightly. The question, of course, is who benefits? An educated woman from Boston might find our simple community restricting, just as our community might find certain Eastern innovations unsuitable. Before Eleanor could respond, Sophie appeared at her side, tugging gently at her sleeve. Father says we should start walking. He needs to prepare for tomorrow's lessons. Of course. Eleanor smiled at the girl, then turned back to Mrs. Montgomery. If you'll excuse me. Certainly. The woman's smile remained fixed. Do consider what I've said, Miss Mitchell. It would be unfortunate if misaligned expectations led to difficulties. Eleanor nodded politely and followed Sophie to where Thomas waited at the church gate. His expression was unusually tense. Is everything all right? She asked quietly as they began walking home. School board politics, he replied tersely. Nothing for you to concern yourself with. His dismissive tone stung more than it should have. If it involves the school where I'm teaching, perhaps it does concern me. Thomas glanced at Sophie, who walked slightly ahead, then lowered his voice. Montgomery is questioning the wisdom of my having brought an overeducated Eastern woman into the classroom without board approval. I see. Eleanor kept her voice steady despite the familiar disappointment washing over her. And you agree with his assessment? I didn't say that. Thomas's jaw tightened. But as schoolmaster, I answer to the board. They control funding, curriculum decisions, even my continued employment. And they object to my presence specifically or to my teaching methods. Both, according to Montgomery, though I suspect his wife's influence in the matter. Eleanor thought of her conversation with Mrs. Montgomery. She made her reservations quite clear just now. Apparently, I represent unwelcome Eastern innovations. They walked in silence for several paces, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Thomas spoke again, his voice softer. I don't share their concerns, Eleanor. Your work with the younger children has been exemplary, but I must navigate these waters carefully, for Sophie's sake, if nothing else. The mention of his daughter's future mollified Eleanor somewhat. Of course, he needed to consider the politics of his position, the security it provided for his child. What would you have me do? Perhaps, he hesitated, perhaps a temporary step back from formal teaching duties while I address the board's concerns. Mrs. Cooper returns tomorrow in any case. The request, reasonable as it was, felt like rejection. Eleanor had found genuine purpose in the classroom, connection with the children, and most importantly, a way to demonstrate her value beyond domestic capabilities. Now, Thomas was asking her to retreat, to become invisible again. I understand, she said finally, her voice more brittle than she intended. I wouldn't wish to complicate your position. Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her directly. This isn't what I want, Eleanor, but small towns run on consensus and tradition. Change must come gradually, with careful diplomacy. And I represent too much change too quickly. She couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. To some, yes. His eyes held genuine regret. Not to me. Surely you must know that by now. Before she could respond, Sophie called from ahead. Father, Miss Mitchell, come quickly. There's something wrong at the house. They hurried forward to where Sophie stood pointing. Smoke curled from the chimney of the Grant home, unusual, as they had banked the fire before leaving for church. As they approached, the front door opened, and a tall, lanky man emerged onto the porch, grinning broadly. About time you all got home, he called. I've been keeping the coffee warm for an hour. Uncle William! Sophie broke into a run, throwing herself into the man's waiting arms. He swung her around, laughing. There's my favorite niece, growing like a weed since summer, aren't you? Thomas's expression had transformed, surprise giving way to genuine pleasure. Will, we weren't expecting you until November. Finished the Denver commission early. Thought I'd surprise you. William Grant's gaze fell on Eleanor, his eyebrows rising with undisguised interest. And this must be the lady I've heard about from your letters. Thomas cleared his throat. Eleanor Mitchell, my brother William. Will is an architect based in Denver. William bounded down the steps, extending his hand to Eleanor with an engaging smile. Where Thomas was reserved and contained, his brother radiated energy and openness. Delighted to meet you, Miss Mitchell. Tommy's letters have been uncommonly interesting since your arrival. Interesting? Eleanor couldn't help smiling as she shook his hand. That sounds rather ominous. On the contrary, Tommy's correspondence typically consists of school board grievances and weather reports. Lately, he's waxed positively philosophical about education, community adaptation, and, if I'm not mistaken, astronomy. Thomas's complexion darkened slightly. Will enjoys exaggeration, a family trait I thankfully avoided. William laughed, clapping his brother on the shoulder. And Tommy maintains the family tradition of understatement. Come inside, I've made a passable stew, though you may need to explain the organization of your kitchen, Miss Mitchell. I'm afraid I may have disrupted things searching for salt. It's not my kitchen, Eleanor corrected gently. I'm still a guest here myself. William shot his brother a questioning look, which Thomas pointedly ignored. Nevertheless, Thomas said, guiding them all toward the door, we appreciate the welcome, unexpected as it is. The afternoon passed pleasantly with William entertaining them with stories of his architectural projects in Denver and his adventures traveling through the mountain towns. Unlike his brother, William was an animated storyteller, punctuating his tales with expressive gestures and impressions of the characters he encountered. Sophie was enthralled, and even Thomas relaxed, the tension from the church conversation temporarily forgotten. So you design buildings in Denver, Eleanor said during a pause in William's narrative. That must be fascinating work. It has its moments, William agreed, though convincing wealthy clients that their townhouse doesn't need Grecian columns and Gothic arches simultaneously can be trying. Will studied in Chicago, Thomas explained with evident pride. He's designed several significant buildings in Denver, including the new public library. William waved off the praise. Enough about my brick-and-mortar adventures. I want to hear about Miss Mitchell's impression of our little mountain outpost. Has Pine Ridge measured up to Boston standards? Pine Ridge and Boston are two different. For comparison, Eleanor replied diplomatically, each has its own character and strengths. Very politic, William observed with a grin. But surely you must miss certain aspects of city life. The theaters, museums, libraries. I do miss the Boston Public Library, Eleanor admitted. But I've found other intellectual satisfactions here. The natural environment, the children's eager minds, and your brother's astronomy lessons have been illuminating. William's eyebrows shot up as he turned to Thomas. Astronomy lessons? You've dusted off the telescope then? It must be serious. The last comment, though light in tone, carried an undercurrent of significance that brought color to Thomas's cheeks. Miss Mitchell expressed interest in celestial observation. Thomas said stiffly, "It seemed appropriate to share what knowledge I possess." "Naturally," William agreed, his eyes twinkling. "And have you shared your theories on celestial mechanics?" As well, Tommy developed quite the reputation at university for challenging conventional planetary models. "Will," Thomas warned, but his brother continued undeterred. He once wrote a paper suggesting Laplace's nebula hypothesis required modification to account for observational discrepancies in Saturn's ring system. Nearly gave his professor apoplexy. Eleanor turned to Thomas with genuine interest. "You never mentioned your research. Have you continued your observations?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Amateur speculations, nothing more. Will exaggerates their significance." He published in the Denver Scientific Journal 3 years ago, William countered, an article on calculating stellar distances using parallax measurement techniques accessible to amateur astronomers. "You're a published astronomer?" Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise or admiration. "Why didn't you mention this?" "Because it's tangential to my primary responsibilities," Thomas replied, though his expression softened at her evident interest. "A hobby, nothing more." "A hobby that had the Denver Observatory director offering you a position," William reminded him, "which you declined." An awkward silence fell. Sophie, who had been listening intently, broke it with characteristic directness. "Father didn't take the job because of me. He didn't want to move me after Mother died." Thomas reached over to smooth his daughter's hair. "It was a simple decision, Sophie. My place was here, with you." The moment held weight, a glimpse into choices made, paths not taken. Eleanor felt a new understanding of Thomas forming. His dedication to his daughter had superseded his own intellectual passions, a sacrifice made without apparent regret. "In any case," William continued more gently, "Tommy's astronomical insights are quite remarkable for someone without formal training in the field. Perhaps you two can collaborate, Miss Mitchell, given your mathematical background." "I would welcome that," Eleanor said sincerely, looking at Thomas, "if you're willing to share your work." Something vulnerable crossed his face. Hope, perhaps, or recognition, perhaps. "Though I fear the school board might consider astronomy another unsuitable Eastern innovation." The reference to their earlier conversation hung in the air, reminding Eleanor of the community resistance she faced. William glanced between them, sensing tension. "School board troubles?" he asked. "Let me guess, Archie Montgomery objecting to something progressive again?" Thomas sighed. Some board members have expressed concern about Eleanor's teaching methods and qualifications. Qualifications? William looked incredulous. "From what Tommy's written, you hold a degree from one of the finest women's colleges in the country. What precisely do they find objectionable? Your competence or your gender?" "Both, I suspect," Eleanor replied with a wry smile, though couched in concerns about traditional values and appropriate education for frontier children. William shook his head in disgust. The same tired arguments trotted out whenever someone threatens the comfortable ignorance of the self-appointed guardians of propriety. "Will," Thomas cautioned, glancing at Sophie, "the situation is more nuanced than that." "Is it?" William challenged. "Or are you once again conceding ground to avoid conflict, regardless of what's right?" An uncomfortable silence fell. Sophie, sensing adult tension, asked to be excused to work on her drawings. Once she had left, Thomas turned to his brother with uncharacteristic sharpness. "You've been here less than a day, Will. Perhaps reserve. Judgment on matters you don't fully understand. I understand that you've found a woman of intelligence and capability who connects with your daughter and shares your intellectual interests," William replied evenly. "And instead of defending her value to the community, you're asking her to step back to appease Archie Montgomery's provincial sensibilities." Eleanor felt caught between fraternal friction she hadn't anticipated. "Please, this isn't necessary. I understand Thomas's position. The school's welfare must come first." "And who defines that welfare?" William countered. "The children benefiting from your teaching methods, or the board members who haven't set foot in a classroom in decades?" Thomas stood abruptly. "I need to check on Sophie." He left the room without further comment, tension evident in every line of his body. William sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so similar to his brother's that Eleanor couldn't help but notice the family resemblance beneath their different temperaments. "I apologize, Miss Mitchell. Tommy and I have been having variations of this argument since childhood. He values harmony and tradition. I favor progress and occasional necessary disruption." "There's wisdom in both approaches," Eleanor offered, though her heart aligned more with William's perspective. He studied her with perceptive eyes. "You care for him." It wasn't a question, and Eleanor didn't treat it as one. "Your brother is a complex man, more so than he first appears." "Yes," William agreed softly. "Tommy has always kept his depths, hidden, especially after Anna died. I wondered if he would ever allow anyone close again." He paused, then added, "Until his letters about you began arriving." "His letters?" Eleanor couldn't help her curiosity. William smiled. "Nothing inappropriate, I assure you. Just a gradual shift in tone. Questions about how one might introduce advanced mathematical concepts to younger students, mentions of evening discussions and shared interests, observations about how Sophie was responding to your presence." Eleanor absorbed this, warming at the thought of Thomas writing about her to his brother. "I'm glad he has you to confide in. Tommy doesn't confide easily, Miss Mitchell. The fact that he's shared anything about your impact on his household is significant." William leaned forward. "Which is why I hope you won't allow Montgomery and his ilk to discourage you." "That's not my intention," Eleanor assured him. "But I must respect Thomas's judgment regarding the school. He's built a life here, established trust with the community. A community that should recognize the gift they've received in you," William countered. "Tommy does recognize it, I'm certain. But my brother has lived so long according to others' expectations that he sometimes forgets to fight for what he truly values." Before Eleanor could respond, a knock sounded at the front door. William rose to answer it, returning moments later with Harriet Wilson, the friendly woman from the general store. "Mrs. Wilson," Eleanor greeted her, rising. "How nice to see you." "Miss Mitchell," Mrs. Wilson nodded, her usually cheerful face uncharacteristically serious. "I'm afraid I've come on an uncomfortable errand. Is Mr. Grant available?" Thomas appeared from the hallway as if summoned. "Mrs. Wilson, what brings you by on a Sunday afternoon?" The plump woman twisted her hands nervously. "I thought you should know. The school board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow evening. Archie Montgomery has raised concerns about Miss Mitchell's role in the classroom." Thomas's expression hardened. "On what grounds?" "He claims to have received complaints from parents about progressive teaching methods, unsuitable for proper development, and undermining traditional values." Mrs. Wilson's disgust at these charges was evident. "It's nonsense, of course. Every mother I know has remarked on how well their children are responding to Miss Mitchell's lessons." "Then why a formal meeting?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Beatrice Montgomery has been busy after church." Mrs. Wilson replied flatly, suggesting that Miss Mitchell's presence represents Eastern interference in Western traditions, that her advanced education makes her incapable of understanding frontier children's needs. That's absurd, William interjected. If anything, advanced education enhances one's ability to adapt teaching to diverse needs. Mrs. Wilson nodded in agreement. Many of us feel the same way, Mr. Grant, which is why I wanted to warn you before tomorrow. You should be prepared to defend Miss Mitchell's contributions. Thomas's gaze flicked to Eleanor, something apologetic in his expression. Thank you for the warning, Mrs. Wilson. I appreciate your candor. After the woman departed, a heavy silence settled over the room. Eleanor felt a familiar sinking sensation, the same she'd experienced when James had begun finding reasons why their intellectual discussions should be curtailed in company, why her mathematical interests were admirable but unnecessary for a potential wife. I should pack my things, she said quietly. What? Both Grant brothers spoke simultaneously. I have no desire to be the center of community controversy, Eleanor explained. If my presence is causing such difficulty... No. Thomas's voice was firmer than she had ever heard it. This is precisely the reaction Montgomery hopes to provoke. Your departure would only confirm his prejudices. William nodded vigorously. Tommy's right. Retreating now would be a victory for narrow-mindedness. Eleanor looked between them, surprised by Thomas's sudden resolve. But you yourself suggested I step back from teaching to ease tensions. That was before I understood Montgomery's true intentions. Thomas moved closer, his expression intense. This isn't simply about teaching methods, Eleanor. This is about whether this community will be ruled by fear of difference or embrace of valuable contributions, regardless of their source. And what of your position? Sophie's security? My position is as educator, Thomas replied with unexpected passion. If I cannot defend quality education because of political pressure, what example do I set for my students, for my daughter? The transformation in him was remarkable, from cautious accommodation to principled determination. Eleanor felt a surge of both admiration and concern. What do you intend to do? Attend the board meeting, Thomas said firmly. Present evidence of your teaching effectiveness. Defend your contributions and qualifications. And if they remain unconvinced, a muscle tightened in his jaw, then I will need to reconsider whether I wish to continue serving a board that values conformity over quality. Thomas, Eleanor breathed, alarmed by the implication. You can't risk your position. Here, everything you've built for this. For what? He challenged softly. For educational principles I believe in? For a woman whose value they refuse to recognize? His gaze held hers. Some principles must be defended, Eleanor, even at cost. William cleared his throat. I hate to interrupt this inspiring moment of backbone development, but perhaps we should consider strategy before martyrdom. I have some experience with boards and their politics. Thomas blinked, as if emerging from intensity into practicality. You're right, of course. We need to prepare for tomorrow's meeting. The rest of the afternoon and evening was devoted to collecting evidence of Eleanor's teaching effectiveness, examples of student work showing improvement, notes from lessons demonstrating her methods, even Sophie's careful documentation of her mother's quilt patterns as evidence of Eleanor's respect for local traditions and knowledge. As they worked, Eleanor observed Thomas with new eyes. The careful, reserved schoolmaster had revealed another aspect of himself, the principled educator willing to stand against community pressure to defend what he believed right. This man, was neither the cold widower who had first greeted her at the train station, nor the cautious negotiator of community expectations she had come to know. This was yet another layer of Thomas Grant, one that resonated with her own convictions about education and knowledge. Late that night, after William had retired to the guest room and Sophie was long asleep, Eleanor found Thomas still at his desk, reviewing notes for the board meeting. "You should rest," she said softly from the doorway. "Tomorrow will be challenging enough without exhaustion." He looked up, the lamplight casting his features in gold and shadow. "I want to be thoroughly prepared. Montgomery is nothing if not methodical in his objections." Eleanor entered the study, moving to stand beside his desk. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "This afternoon, your willingness to challenge the board, potentially risk your position, is it truly about educational principles, or is there something more?" Thomas set down his pen, meeting her gaze directly. "Does there need to be something more than defending what's right?" "No," she acknowledged, "but such sudden resolve suggests additional motivation." He was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "When Anna died, I retreated into safety, routines, traditions, community approval. I taught as expected, lived as expected, raised Sophie according to conventional wisdom. It was easier than pursuing my own vision, which had always met with resistance. That's understandable, especially while grieving, perhaps," he sighed. "But in doing so, I compromised parts of myself I once valued, my intellectual curiosity, my belief in education as transformation rather than mere transmission of accepted knowledge. And now? Now I find myself unwilling to continue those compromises." His eyes held hers steadily, particularly when they require me to devalue someone whose mind and spirit I've come to admire greatly. The simple declaration, delivered without flourish or sentimentality, touched Eleanor deeply. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing. My contribution matters." "It matters," Thomas confirmed. "You matter, Eleanor. To the students, to Sophie." He hesitated, then finished quietly. "To me." The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant. Eleanor felt the weight of his admission, the personal risk beyond professional principles. "Then we will face tomorrow together," she said finally. "Whatever comes of it." Thomas's expression softened with something like hope. "Whatever comes," he agreed. "Though I warn you, school board meetings in Pine Ridge can be formidable affairs. I've faced Boston society matrons questioning my spinsterhood and intellectual pursuits," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "I suspect I can manage Archie Montgomery's objections to my teaching methods." Thomas laughed softly, a warm, genuine sound she'd rarely heard from him. "I don't doubt it, though perhaps we shouldn't mention your controversial views on planetary motion. Montgomery might fear you'll corrupt the children with astronomical heresies. I shall keep my celestial theories strictly between us," Eleanor promised, her heart lightening at this unexpected moment of shared humor amid tension. Thomas rose, suddenly seeming to realize the lateness of the hour and their solitude. "We should both seek rest. Tomorrow will require all our faculties." "Indeed." Eleanor moved toward the door, then paused. "Thomas?" "Yes?" "I'm glad I came. To Pine Ridge," she said simply. "Whatever happens tomorrow." His expression held a mixture of tenderness and resolve that made her breath catch. "So am I, Eleanor. More than I can properly express." She nodded, unable to trust her voice with further response, and made her way upstairs to her room. Outside her window, the stars gleamed in the clear mountain sky, distant, brilliant, and suddenly full of possibility rather than cold isolation. Tomorrow would bring challenge, perhaps conflict, but tonight Eleanor Mitchell felt something she had not experienced in years, the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, standing beside someone who saw her true value. Monday dawned grey and threatening, the perfect sky of Sunday replaced by low clouds that pressed against the mountains. Eleanor woke early, her sleep having been fitful at best. Today would determine not just her place in Pine Ridge, but potentially Thomas's future as well. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders as she dressed in her most professional attire. A high-necked burgundy dress with modest trim, severe but dignified. At breakfast, the tension was palpable. Even Sophie, usually chatty, with William, ate in uncharacteristic silence, her eyes moving between the adults with worried awareness beyond her years. William attempted to lighten the mood with stories of architectural disasters, but his humor fell flat against the approaching confrontation. "Will you both be at the meeting tonight?" Sophie finally asked, pushing her half-eaten porridge away. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances. They had debated this point the previous evening, whether Eleanor's presence would exacerbate tensions or demonstrate confidence in her position. "Yes," Thomas answered firmly. "Miss Mitchell has every right to address questions about her teaching methods directly." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Montgomery says educated women don't know how to talk to ordinary folk, but that's not true about Miss Mitchell. She explains things clear as anything." Eleanor felt a rush of affection for this perceptive child. "Thank you, Sophie. That might be the finest compliment I've received as a teacher." "Where will Sophie stay during the meeting?" William asked. "If it becomes contentious." "Reverend Wilson's wife offered to keep her at the parsonage," Thomas replied, "with her granddaughter for company." Eleanor glanced at the clock. "I should prepare for the day. Mrs. Cooper returns this morning, and I'd like to provide her with detailed notes on each child's progress." "You needn't go to the school today," Thomas said gently, "given the circumstances." "On the contrary," Eleanor countered, straightening her shoulders. "I should maintain normal routines. Skulking away would only suggest I have something to hide." Thomas studied her face, then nodded with something like pride. "As you wish. Though, perhaps focus on assisting Mrs. Cooper rather than direct instruction. A transitional approach might be wiser today." "Tactical retreat rather than surrender," William observed with approval. "Sensible compromise, Tommy." The walk to school was quiet. The three adults lost in thought while Sophie skipped ahead, temporarily unburdened by adult concerns. At the schoolhouse door, several mothers waited with their children. Their expressions as they noticed Eleanor ranged from warm greeting to careful neutrality to outright suspicion. "Good morning," Thomas said with professional courtesy. "Please send the children in to prepare for lessons." As the students filed past, Martha, the quiet girl with the mathematical aptitude, broke away to approach Eleanor. "Miss Mitchell," she whispered, pressing a small object into Eleanor's hand. "I made this for you." Eleanor looked down to find a carefully carved wooden star, small enough to fit in her palm. "It's beautiful, Martha. Did you make it yourself?" The girl nodded. "Pa helped with the sharp cuts. It's a thank you for teaching me about patterns. Ma says I counted all the fence posts on our property yesterday without getting mixed up once." "What a wonderful accomplishment," Eleanor praised her, genuinely touched. "I shall treasure this." Martha beamed before hurrying inside. Eleanor closed her fingers around the small gift, finding unexpected strength in this tangible evidence of her impact. Mrs. Cooper arrived shortly thereafter, a thin, careworn woman with kind eyes and practical manner. "Miss Mitchell," she greeted Eleanor warmly. "I hear you've worked wonders with my young ones while I was away." "Hardly wonders," Eleanor demurred, "though we've made some progress with new approaches to foundation skills." "Tommy tells me you've documented everything," Mrs. Cooper said, hanging her shawl on a peg by the door. "I'm most eager to learn what's been successful." For the next hour, as Thomas conducted lessons with the older students, Eleanor and Mrs. Cooper sat at a small table in the corner, reviewing each child's work and discussing teaching strategies. To Eleanor's surprise and relief, Mrs. Cooper showed genuine interest in her methods. "These pattern exercises for mathematics," Mrs. Cooper noted with approval. "Simple but effective. And having the children teach concepts to each other, I've never considered that approach. It reinforces learning for the teacher while providing peer instruction for the learner," Eleanor explained. "Children sometimes understand each other's explanations better than ours." Mrs. Cooper nodded thoughtfully. "Makes good sense when you explain it that way." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I've heard about tonight's meeting. Shame what some folks are saying about your teaching." "You don't share their concerns?" Eleanor asked carefully. "I judge by results, Miss Mitchell. And what I'm seeing here," she tapped the student work samples, "are results. These children have progressed more in 2 weeks than they might have in a month of standard recitation." Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude for this practical woman's assessment. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. Your opinion holds significant weight, given your experience with these children." Mrs. Cooper glanced toward where Thomas was conducting a geography lesson, then leaned closer. "Would you consider writing down some of these methods for me? For after—" She didn't complete the sentence, but her meaning was clear, for after Eleanor was gone, whether by choice or the board's demand. "I'd be happy to," Eleanor agreed, touched by the request. "Perhaps we could work on it together this afternoon. I'm sure you have insights that would improve the approaches." They spent the remainder of the morning and early afternoon collaboratively, documenting teaching strategies. Eleanor was careful to emphasize connections to traditional methods while introducing progressive elements, creating a bridge between familiar practices and innovation. Mrs. Cooper proved an eager collaborator, her practical experience complementing Eleanor's theoretical knowledge. Throughout the day, Eleanor was acutely aware of Thomas watching their collaboration with approval, though his expression grew increasingly tense as the hour of the board meeting approached. When school dismissed, he asked Mrs. Cooper to walk Sophie to the parsonage, while he and Eleanor returned home to prepare final notes for the evening's confrontation. William met them at the house, his expression serious. "News from town," he announced without preamble. "Montgomery has rallied several influential citizens to attend tonight. They're framing this as a matter of community standards rather than educational methods." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Political maneuvering, exactly as I feared." "It's more than that," William continued. "Beatrice Montgomery has been suggesting that Eleanor's presence represents inappropriate familiarity prior to any formal arrangement. Propriety concerns," Eleanor translated flatly. "My living under your roof without an official engagement is being questioned." "Precisely," William confirmed. "Though, of course, that's merely a convenient weapon rather than a genuine moral concern. If you were a traditionally minded woman without advanced education, I doubt they'd raise such objections." Thomas paced the small parlor, frustration evident in every movement. "This transforms the issue from professional to personal, makes it more difficult to address on merit alone." Eleanor sat perfectly still, years of social training enabling her to maintain composure despite the humiliation of having her character questioned. "Perhaps I should secure lodging elsewhere. Remove that particular avenue of attack." "Absolutely not," Thomas responded immediately. "That would only validate their tactics. Besides, there's nowhere suitable in Pine Ridge for a single woman to board on short notice." "We could announce an engagement," William suggested pragmatically. "Formal intention would address the propriety question." The room fell silent. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at the casual proposal, though, of course, an engagement had been the ostensible purpose of her journey to Pine Ridge. Thomas looked equally discomfited by his brother's suggestion. "That would be premature," Thomas said carefully, his eyes meeting Eleanor's briefly before looking away, "and transparent as a tactical response rather than a genuine commitment. Besides," Eleanor added softly, "I would not wish any man to feel obligated to offer marriage simply to counter gossip or political maneuvering." William looked between them, something knowing in his expression, of course, merely suggesting practical options. He cleared his throat. "In that case, we must focus on the educational merits and documentation. I've taken the liberty of drafting some talking points based on your notes." As the afternoon faded toward evening, they refined their approach. Eleanor organized student work samples showing clear progress. Thomas prepared a measured defense of progressive teaching methods within traditional frameworks. William, drawing on his experience with boards and commissions, suggested strategic responses to likely objections. At 6:30, they departed for the town hall where the meeting would be held. The sky had darkened further, and the first drops of cold rain began to fall as they walked, a fitting accompaniment to their grim mood. "Remember," William advised as they approached the white clapboard building, "maintain dignity regardless of provocation. Appeal to pragmatic results rather than abstract principles, and let Tommy take the lead. As schoolmaster, his position carries weight." Eleanor nodded, squaring her shoulders. "I understand." Thomas paused before they reached the steps, turning to face her directly. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "whatever happens in there, know that that is, Sophie and I, value your contributions immensely. One board meeting cannot change that." The simple declaration steadied her. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Inside, the town hall's main chamber had been arranged with a long table at the front, where 5 men sat in serious conversation. The school board members, including Archibald Montgomery at the center, his distinguished appearance conveying authority. Rows of chairs faced them, already half filled with townspeople who turned to stare as Eleanor entered with the Grant brothers. Reverend Wilson approached them immediately, his kind face concerned. "Thomas, Miss Mitchell, I wish this gathering were under more pleasant circumstances. Sophie is settled with my wife and granddaughter, making cookies and quite content." "Thank you, Reverend," Thomas replied. "We appreciate your support." "Yes, well," the pastor glanced toward the board table. "I've attempted to counsel moderation in this matter, but some minds are rather firmly set." He lowered his voice. "Mrs. Cooper asked me to inform you she intends to speak on Miss Mitchell's behalf regarding the children's progress. That may carry significant weight." Before they could respond, the room quieted as Montgomery struck a small gavel on the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, this emergency session of the Pine Ridge School Board will come to order. We face an urgent matter regarding educational standards and community values that cannot await our regular monthly meeting." Eleanor took a seat between Thomas and William in the front row, maintaining perfect posture despite her racing heart. Montgomery continued with procedural matters before addressing the reason for their gathering. "It has come to the board's attention that significant changes to our school's established curriculum and teaching methods have been implemented without proper review or approval. Additionally, concerns have been raised about the qualifications and suitability of a temporary instructor engaged without board consultation." Thomas rose immediately. "Mr. Chairman, if I may address these points." Montgomery nodded with cold courtesy. "The floor recognizes Schoolmaster Grant." Thomas stood tall, his voice steady and carrying to every corner of the room. "Honorable board members, fellow citizens, as schoolmaster, I take my responsibility to provide quality education seriously. When Mrs. Cooper required leave to care for her ill son, I secured assistance from Miss Eleanor Mitchell, a highly qualified educator with experience in both mathematics and literature instruction. He gestured toward Eleanor. Miss Mitchell holds a degree from Mount Holyoke College and has served as a tutor to students of various ages for the past decade. Her methods, while incorporating some innovative approaches, remain firmly grounded in fundamental educational principles this community values. A murmur ran through the gathered citizens. Montgomery's expression remained impassive. The results, Thomas continued, speak for themselves. In just 2 weeks, several students who previously struggled with basic arithmetic have demonstrated marked improvement. Children reluctant to participate in recitation now engage actively in learning. Mrs. Cooper herself has documented this progress and requested to continue implementing certain techniques Miss Mitchell introduced. He produced a folder of student work samples. I've brought evidence of this advancement for the board's review. Far from undermining our educational standards, Miss Mitchell's contributions have enhanced them, benefiting the children this institution exists to serve. Montgomery received the folder with a perfunctory nod. The board acknowledges your statement, Mr. Grant. However, questions remain about both the methods employed and the manner of Miss Mitchell's engagement. A man to Montgomery's right, a rancher named Peterson, whom Eleanor recognized from church, leaned forward. What exactly are these new methods? We've heard concerning reports about games replacing proper recitation, children teaching other children rather than listening to the instructor, and irregular exercises replacing standard lessons. Thomas began to respond, but Eleanor gently touched his arm and rose to her feet. If I may address this question directly, Mr. Peterson. Montgomery frowned slightly but nodded permission. Thank you, Eleanor said, meeting the rancher's gaze. With professional composure, what you've described as games are structured activities designed to engage different learning styles. For example, when teaching addition to younger students, I introduced pattern recognition using physical objects they can manipulate. Pebbles arranged in geometric formations that make mathematical relationships visible. She proceeded to explain several techniques clearly and without educational jargon, emphasizing practical applications. When Martha Thompson couldn't grasp multiplication through standard recitation, I showed her how to visualize it as fence posts in rows and columns, something familiar from her home environment. Yesterday, her mother reported she counted every fence post on their property without error. Mrs. Thompson, seated several rows back, nodded confirmation. It's true. Never seen the child take to figures like that before. Eleanor continued, with measured confidence. As for children teaching one another, this approach reinforces learning for both parties. The child explaining a concept must understand it thoroughly enough to articulate it, while the listener often comprehends a peer's explanation differently than an adult's. Her explanation complete, Eleanor resumed her seat, noting with satisfaction that several board members appeared thoughtful. Only Montgomery's expression remained skeptical. These methods may produce certain short-term results, he conceded, but they represent significant departures from proven educational traditions. Pine Ridge parents expect their children to receive conventional instruction, not experimental approaches imported from Eastern institutions. Mrs. Cooper, who had been sitting quietly near the back, stood up. Mr. Montgomery, if I might contribute to this discussion. The board recognizes Mrs. Cooper. The assistant teacher moved forward, her practical demeanor commanding respect despite her unassuming appearance. I've taught the younger children of Pine Ridge for 7 years. Upon returning to the classroom today, I carefully reviewed Miss Mitchell's methods and the children's progress. I must report with complete professional conviction that her approaches have produced remarkable advancement in several students who previously struggled. She held up a small notebook. I've documented specific improvements in each child's performance. Tommy Reynolds, who couldn't count past 30 without confusion, now manages sequences to 100 accurately. Martha Thompson's progress has been mentioned. Emma Wilson has expanded her vocabulary significantly through the word collection exercise Miss Mitchell introduced. Mrs. Cooper looked directly at Montgomery. As educators, our responsibility is to the children's learning by whatever effective methods accomplish that goal. I intend to continue using several of Miss Mitchell's techniques because they work, plain and simple. A murmur of approval ran through the room. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected ally. Montgomery's expression tightened. While we appreciate Mrs. Cooper's assessment, there are additional concerns beyond teaching methods. He glanced at Eleanor with cool disapproval. Questions of propriety have been raised regarding Miss Mitchell's living arrangements with the unmarried schoolmaster, an arrangement that presents a concerning example for impressionable students. The room fell silent. Thomas stood immediately, his voice tight with controlled anger. Mr. Montgomery, Miss Mitchell resides in my home as an honored guest, with my daughter present at all times. To suggest impropriety is both offensive and beneath the dignity of this proceeding. Nevertheless, Montgomery persisted, appearance matters in a position of community trust. The schoolmaster and those associated with our children's education must maintain unimpeachable standards of conduct. William Grant rose to his feet, his usual good humor replaced by cold precision. As Thomas's brother and current houseguest, I can attest to the absolute propriety of all arrangements. More importantly, I must question the relevance of personal, living situations to an educational evaluation. Unless the board is suggesting that a woman's intelligence becomes threatening only when combined with presumed moral compromise. His pointed question hung in the air, causing several board members to shift uncomfortably. Reverend Wilson stood slowly, his authoritative presence drawing all eyes. "If I may speak to this particular concern," he said gravely, "as Pine Ridge's spiritual leader, matters of moral conduct fall within my purview. I have observed nothing in Miss Mitchell's residence at the Grant home that warrants community concern. Furthermore, I find it troubling that we would weaponize presumptions about personal arrangements to avoid addressing educational substance." A woman's voice called from the middle of the room. Mrs. Wilson, the friendly shopkeeper. "Seems to me these concerns didn't exist until Beatrice Montgomery realized Miss Mitchell might be more than a temporary visitor." Laughter rippled through the crowd, quickly suppressed as Montgomery brought his gavel down sharply. "Order, please. This is a formal proceeding." Eleanor had remained seated during this exchange, the public discussion of her personal situation, bringing a flush of humiliation to her cheeks despite her determined composure. Now she rose slowly, every eye in the room upon her. "Mr. Montgomery, honored board members, citizens of Pine Ridge," she began, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I came to your community not to disrupt traditions or impose foreign ideas, but because I believed my skills might be of service here. The advertisement Mr. Grant placed specifically sought an educated woman capable of assisting with lessons." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I understand change can be concerning, particularly when it involves your children's future. But I ask you to consider, is education about preserving particular methods or about effectively developing young minds? Are we serving children best by insisting on uniformity or by recognizing that different minds learn in different ways?" Eleanor looked around the room, making eye contact with parents whose children she had taught. "I have introduced no radical philosophies, no controversial content. I have simply offered alternative paths to the same educational destinations. You all value literacy, numeracy, critical thinking." Her voice softened. "As for questions of propriety, I can only say that I have conducted myself with the same dignity and restraint I would expect of my students. If my presence in Mr. Grant's home raises concerns, I am willing to seek alternative arrangements, though, as Mr. Grant noted, options are limited in Pine Ridge. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze returning to Montgomery. However, I would ask whether these concerns are truly about propriety or about discomfort with a woman whose education challenges certain assumptions about a woman's proper place and capabilities. A heavy silence followed her words. Thomas reached for her hand, squeezing it briefly in silent support before she resumed her seat. Montgomery's expression had darkened at her final point, but before he could respond, the door at the back of the hall burst open. Sophie Grant stood in the doorway, breathless and determined, having clearly run through the rain that was now falling steadily outside. Behind her, Mrs. Wilson's flustered face appeared. "I'm sorry, Thomas," the pastor's wife called. She insisted she had something important to say and simply ran off before I could stop her. "Sophie," Thomas said with concern, "you should be at the parsonage." "I need to talk to the board," Sophie declared, marching forward with remarkable composure for a 10-year-old. She stopped directly in front of the board table, her small figure facing the 5 men with unwavering resolve. "It's important." Montgomery's severe expression softened slightly at the child's earnestness. "Young lady, this is an adult proceeding." "It's about my education," Sophie interrupted. "That makes it my business too." A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the crowd. Even Thomas looked torn between dismay at his daughter's boldness and pride in her courage. Montgomery sighed. "Very well, Miss Grant. What would you like to say?" Sophie took a deep breath. "When my mother died, I stopped talking much at school. It was too hard to explain things when people asked questions. Father tried to help, but he gets frustrated when words don't come out right." The room grew very quiet, the adults suddenly aware they were witnessing something significant. "Miss Mitchell doesn't get mad when I can't explain," Sophie continued. "She showed me I can draw things first, then find the words. She helped me make a book of Mother's quilt patterns, so I won't forget how to make them when I'm older." She pulled a small notebook from her pocket, opening it to reveal carefully documented geometric patterns with measurements and color notations. Mother was good at math, but nobody knew except Father. Miss Mitchell says women can be good at lots of things if they're allowed to learn properly. Sophie looked directly at Montgomery. "If Miss Mitchell leaves, who will teach me about stars and mathematics? Who will help the little kids who learn differently? Who will make Father smile again?" The last question hung in the air, its innocent directness striking at the heart of what many in the room had observed but not articulated. Thomas's face showed a complex mixture of emotion, embarrassment, tenderness, and something deeper that caused Eleanor's heart to quicken. Montgomery cleared his throat, visibly discomfited by the child's intervention. "Thank you, Miss Grant. Your perspective is noted. Now perhaps you should return to—" "I'm not finished," Sophie said firmly, causing several gasps from those unaccustomed to children addressing adults so directly. "Miss Mitchell knows more than just school books. She knows how to listen. She knows that thinking differently isn't thinking wrong. The other children need that too." She turned to face the assembled townspeople. "My mother would have liked Miss Mitchell. She always said Pine Ridge needed more women who spoke their minds." With that declaration, Sophie walked to Eleanor's side and took her hand, a gesture of alliance that brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. The room erupted in murmured conversation. Montgomery gavelled unsuccessfully for order as parents began speaking over one another, many defending Eleanor's teaching methods, others expressing uncertainty, a few maintaining opposition. Through it all, Sophie remained beside Eleanor, her small hand warm and steadfast. Thomas rose to address the increasingly chaotic gathering. "Perhaps," he suggested, his voice cutting through the noise, We might take a brief recess to collect our thoughts. These are complex matters deserving thoughtful consideration. Montgomery seized the suggestion gratefully. The board will recess for 15 minutes. As the room dispersed into smaller conversational groups, Thomas knelt before Sophie. "That was very brave," he said softly, "but also not entirely appropriate, young lady." "I know," Sophie admitted, "but sometimes important things need saying, even if they're not proper. Miss Mitchell taught me that." Thomas glanced up at Eleanor with a mixture of exasperation and admiration. "Did she indeed?" "Not in so many words," Eleanor hastened to clarify, "though I may have suggested that truth sometimes requires courage." "Clearly the lesson was well received," William observed with barely suppressed amusement. "Sophie delivers quite the compelling argument." Montgomery looked positively flummoxed. Thomas rose, keeping one hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Nevertheless, Sophie, you should return to Mrs. Wilson now. Board proceedings aren't suitable for children." "But I want to know what happens," Sophie protested. "I promise to tell you everything," Thomas assured her, "but adults need to resolve this matter through proper channels." As Mrs. Wilson escorted a reluctant Sophie back to the parsonage, Reverend Wilson approached their small group. "That child has her mother's spirit," he observed with gentle approval. "Anna never shied from speaking necessary truths either. Sometimes too necessary," Thomas replied ruefully. "I apologize for the disruption." "No apology needed," the pastor assured him. "In fact, Sophie's intervention may have accomplished what all our adult reasoning could not. She reminded everyone that education serves children, not institutional preferences." He glanced toward where the board members were conferring in low voices. "Montgomery's position appears less certain now. Several parents have approached board members directly during this recess, speaking favorably of their children's progress under Miss Mitchell's instruction." Eleanor absorbed this information with cautious optimism. "Do you believe the board might reconsider its position?" "I believe they're recognizing that this issue has more dimensions than they initially understood," Reverend Wilson replied diplomatically, "and that community sentiment is more divided than Mrs. Montgomery suggested." As the meeting reconvened, Eleanor noted subtle shifts in the room's atmosphere. Montgomery's imperious certainty had diminished, while the other board members appeared more thoughtful, occasionally conferring with one another as citizens offered additional testimonials about children's educational experiences. Finally, after all perspectives had been heard, Montgomery addressed the gathering. "Having considered the evidence and community input, the board acknowledges Miss Mitchell's teaching qualifications and the positive results reported by Mrs. Cooper and several parents." He paused, clearly choosing his next words carefully. "However, concerns remain about proper protocols for introducing new educational methods and engaging temporary instructors without board approval. Therefore, the board proposes the following resolution." Eleanor held her breath as he continued. "Miss Mitchell may continue assisting Mrs. Cooper with the younger students on a provisional basis, provided all teaching methods are documented and submitted for board review. Mr. Grant will develop a formal process for future curricular modifications." And here Montgomery's voice took on a note of pointed emphasis. "Appropriate arrangements should be made to address concerns regarding living situations." The compromise, while far from a complete vindication, represented a significant concession from Montgomery's initial position. Thomas rose to respond. "The board's conditions are reasonable," he acknowledged. "Documentation of teaching methods will proceed immediately, and I welcome a formal process for curricular review that balances educational effectiveness with community values." He straightened his shoulders, meeting Montgomery's gaze directly. "As for the final point, I can assure the board that all arrangements will be entirely appropriate. The carefully worded response left the specific solution undefined, a diplomatic ambiguity that allowed everyone to save face while postponing the more personal matter. As the meeting adjourned, townspeople approached Eleanor with varied reactions, some offering congratulations on the partial victory, others maintaining polite distance, a few expressing genuine interest in her teaching approaches. Through it all, she maintained composed dignity, aware that Thomas watched her with quiet pride. The rain had intensified by the time they departed, forcing them to hurry through puddle-strewn streets toward home. William had gone ahead to collect Sophie from the parsonage, leaving Thomas and Eleanor to walk alone beneath a shared umbrella. "You were magnificent," Thomas said, once they were beyond earshot of lingering townspeople. "Your composure, your clarity, even Montgomery couldn't dismiss your explanations entirely." "Sophie was the true hero tonight," Eleanor replied. "Her intervention changed the entire tenor of the proceedings." "Yes, though we'll need to have a serious discussion about interrupting public meetings," Thomas noted, though without real severity. "She's becoming quite the independent thinker, something I attribute at least partly to your influence." They walked in companionable silence for several moments, the rain drumming steadily on the umbrella above them. "We should discuss Montgomery's final condition," Eleanor said finally, addressing the unspoken question between them, "regarding appropriate arrangements." Thomas slowed his pace, choosing his words carefully. "There are several possibilities. Mrs. Wilson mentioned a room might become available above the general store next month. Or Reverend Wilson might know of a family willing to host a boarder. Those are sensible options," Eleanor agreed, trying to ignore the inexplicable disappointment she felt at his practical response. "Though I would miss my daily interactions with Sophie." Thomas stopped walking entirely, turning to face her despite the rain that now splashed against their shoulders. "Eleanor, there is another possibility, one that would resolve all concerns permanently." Her heart quickened at his serious expression. "Yes? I brought you to Pine Ridge to determine if we might suit as husband and wife," he said quietly. "We've approached that question cautiously, each with our own reservations. Mine stemmed from fear that an educated woman would find frontier life lacking, would come to resent its limitations, as others before you have." He took a deep breath. "I no longer harbor that fear. You've demonstrated not just adaptability, but genuine appreciation for this community, despite its flaws. You've connected with Sophie in ways I could only hope for. And you've reawakened parts of myself I thought permanently dormant. Intellectual, curiosity, professional courage, even the capacity for—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "joy." Eleanor stood perfectly still, raindrops falling unnoticed around them as his words sank in. "If you feel we might truly suit," Thomas continued, his voice gaining confidence, "I would be honored to formalize our arrangement as originally intended. Not to satisfy Montgomery's propriety concerns, but because I have come to value your presence in our lives more than I can adequately express." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but certain. "I don't offer grand romance or passionate declarations. But I do offer honest regard, deep respect, and the promise that your mind will never be considered too educated or your spirit too independent in our home." Eleanor looked into his face, this complex man who had revealed himself layer by layer. Over the weeks, the reserved schoolmaster, the grieving widower, the frustrated astronomer, the protective father, the principled educator who had stood beside her tonight against community pressure, each aspect forming a whole she had come to admire deeply. "Thomas," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I came to Pine Ridge seeking purpose beyond Boston's limitations. I found that, but I also found something unexpected. A place where all of who I am might be valued, not despite my education, but because of how I apply it." She tightened her fingers around his, I would be honored to accept your proposal, not as a solution to practical problems, but as the beginning of a partnership I believe could bring great happiness to us both, and to Sophie. The relief and joy that transformed his features was answer enough, but Thomas responded by drawing her slightly closer beneath the umbrella's shelter. "May I?" he asked simply. At her nod, he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss upon her lips, brief, tender, and full of promise. As they drew apart, both slightly breathless despite the chaste nature of the exchange, Eleanor felt a certainty settle in her heart. This was no passionate whirlwind like she had experienced in her youth with James, but something deeper, more substantial, a connection built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine understanding. "We should continue home," Thomas said, softly, though he made no immediate move to resume walking. "Sophie will be full of questions about the meeting's outcome, and we'll have quite the answer for her," Eleanor replied with a small smile. Thomas nodded, his expression lighter than Eleanor had ever seen it. "She predicted this, you know, told me weeks ago that you belonged with us. Children sometimes see truth more clearly than adults, clouded by caution and past disappointments." They resumed their walk through the rain-soaked streets, closer together now, beneath the umbrella's protection. Ahead, the lights of the Grant home glowed warm against the darkness, and Eleanor felt a surge of certainty that had eluded her throughout her adult life. The knowledge that she was walking not just toward a house, but toward home. Inside, they found Sophie and William engaged in an animated game of checkers, the girl still buzzing with excitement from her dramatic intervention at the meeting. "You're back!" Sophie exclaimed, jumping up from her chair. "What happened after I left? Did they let Miss Mitchell stay? Will she keep teaching us?" Thomas exchanged a glance with Eleanor, a silent communication passing between them about how to share their news. "The board has agreed that Miss Mitchell may continue assisting at the school," he began, removing his rain-dampened coat. "That's wonderful." Sophie clapped her hands together. "I knew they would understand once I explained properly." "Your explanation certainly helped," Thomas acknowledged, with a mixture of pride and lingering parental concern. "Though we'll discuss proper meeting protocols another time." William observed them with knowing eyes. "You both look remarkably pleased for people who've only secured a partial victory. Anything else to report from your walk home?" Thomas cleared, his throat a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "As a matter of fact, yes. Eleanor and I have decided to proceed with our original arrangement. We'll be married, assuming the necessary preparations can be made in reasonable time." Sophie's reaction was immediate and joyful, a glad cry as she launched herself toward Eleanor, wrapping small arms around her waist. "I knew it! I told Uncle William you would stay forever." "Did you indeed?" Eleanor laughed, returning the embrace. "Such confidence in a matter still being determined. I saw how Father looks at you when you talk about mathematics," Sophie stated matter-of-factly. "The same way he used to look at Mother when she explained her quilt patterns, like you're saying the most important things he's ever heard." Thomas appeared momentarily flustered by his daughter's perceptiveness. "Sophie has quite the imagination," he murmured. "But keen observation skills," William noted with a broad grin, rising to offer his congratulations. "Well done, Tommy. You've managed not to drive away the most suitable woman to enter Pine Ridge in years. And Eleanor, my condolences on acquiring such a stubborn, principled brother-in-law, though I suspect those very qualities are part of his appeal." As the evening progressed into a small, impromptu celebration of their engagement, with Sophie extracting promises regarding wedding details and her role in the ceremony, Eleanor found herself observing her soon-to-be family with quiet wonder. The path that had led her here, from Boston drawing rooms to this modest frontier home, had been neither straight nor expected. Yet standing in this warm kitchen, watching Thomas laugh at his brother's teasing while Sophie sketched preliminary designs for wedding decorations. Eleanor Mitchell felt the certainty of belonging she had sought all her adult life. Her education hadn't been an impediment to happiness, but the very thing that had brought her here, to a man who valued her mind, a child who needed her particular understanding, and a community where she might contribute meaningfully. The schoolmaster had indeed recognized her value, not despite her education, but because of the woman it had helped her become. Later, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor heard a soft knock at her door. Opening it, she found Sophie standing in her nightgown, a folded paper in her hands. "I made this for you," the girl said, offering the paper with uncharacteristic shyness. Eleanor unfolded it to find a carefully drawn picture of 3 figures standing before the schoolhouse: a tall man with a book, a woman with stars around her head, and a small girl between them, all holding hands. "It's beautiful, Sophie," Eleanor said softly. "Thank you." Sophie pointed to the stars drawn around the woman's head. "That's your smart ideas. Father says your mind shines bright as the night sky." She frowned slightly. "Does that mean I'll have to call you Mother now?" Eleanor knelt to meet Sophie at eye level. "You may call me whatever feels right to you. Names aren't as important as what we mean to each other." The girl considered this solemnly. "I think I'll just call you Eleanor for now, but maybe someday." She didn't finish the thought, but her meaning was clear. "That sounds perfect," Eleanor agreed, smoothing Sophie's already mussed hair. "Now off to bed. Tomorrow promises to be an eventful day." Indeed, the following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. News of their engagement spread quickly through Pine Ridge, met with reactions ranging from genuine congratulations to reluctant acceptance. Mrs. Cooper proved an unexpected ally, enthusiastically implementing Eleanor's teaching methods and reporting positive results to skeptical parents. Most surprising was Beatrice Montgomery's reaction. After an initial period of frosty distance, she approached Eleanor after church one Sunday with what appeared to be a peace offering. "Miss Mitchell, or soon-to-be Mrs. Grant, I should say, I understand you've been helping document Anna Grant's quilting patterns for Sophie." Eleanor nodded cautiously. "Yes, it's been a rewarding project. Anna's mathematical precision was remarkable." "Indeed." Mrs. Montgomery hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic humility. "I was Anna's closest friend in Pine Ridge. We quilted together weekly before her illness. I've been concerned that her legacy might be overlooked by someone from outside our traditions." Understanding dawned. "You were protecting her memory," Eleanor said softly. "Perhaps not in the most gracious manner," Mrs. Montgomery admitted. "But yes, among other concerns." Eleanor considered her response carefully. "Would you consider reviewing our documentation? Your insights as Anna's friend would be invaluable to ensuring we've captured the essence of her work." Surprise flickered across the woman's face, followed by something like respect. "I would be pleased to contribute." Anna would have wanted Sophie to inherit her knowledge, regardless of who preserved it. This tentative bridge extended. Other relationships throughout the community gradually shifted. Eleanor found her place not by conforming to Pine Ridge's expectations, but by demonstrating how her education could serve shared values, children's growth, preservation of meaningful traditions, and community advancement. Their wedding took place on a crisp December morning, snow dusting the distant mountains like powdered sugar. The small church overflowed with townspeople. Even Archibald Montgomery attended, though he maintained a dignified reserve throughout the ceremony. Eleanor wore a simple gown of deep blue rather than traditional white, acknowledging her mature status without apology. Thomas, in his best suit, appeared simultaneously nervous and more content than anyone in town could remember seeing him. Sophie stood proudly beside them, serving as both flower girl and ring bearer, her solemn face breaking into periodic smiles she couldn't contain. William, as best man, maintained a running commentary of whispered jokes that helped calm his brother's nerves. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Wilson began, his kind eyes surveying the gathered congregation, "we witness today not just the union of two individuals, but the formation of a family built on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine affection." As they exchanged simple vows, promises of partnership, support, and faithfulness, Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness. This was no fairy tale romance, but something more enduring, a connection formed through recognition of each other's true worth. When Thomas slipped a ring onto her finger, a simple gold band engraved with tiny stars, he whispered for her ears alone, "No longer Miss Mitchell, too educated for comfort." She smiled, recognizing his gentle reference to their journey. "Just educated enough for happiness, I think." The wedding celebration afterward reflected their blended sensibilities, traditional frontier hospitality mixed with touches of Eleanor's Eastern background. Sophie proudly displayed the first completed quilt from her mother's patterns, worked on by both Eleanor and Beatrice Montgomery in a collaboration no one would have predicted months earlier. As evening approached, William orchestrated a special surprise. While guests mingled in the church hall, he led the new family outside where he had set up Thomas's telescope, carefully aligned despite the daylight. "A wedding gift," he announced. "Venus is visible now, even before sunset. The ancients considered it the embodiment of love's brightness, outshining temporary darkness." Thomas helped Sophie look through the eyepiece first, the girl's delight evident as she spotted the distant planet. Then he turned to Eleanor, his hand warm on her back as she bent to observe the celestial body. "It's beautiful," she murmured, straightening to meet his gaze. "One day," Thomas said quietly, "I'll build a proper observatory behind our home. Nothing elaborate, just a suitable place for star observation and mathematical calculations." "Our home," Eleanor repeated, savoring the words, "with room for books and telescopes and quilting frames. And perhaps," he added carefully, "additional bedrooms, should our family grow in time." The possibility, one they had discussed only tentatively before now, brought warmth to her cheeks. "I would welcome that prospect," she replied softly. Their moment was interrupted by Sophie tugging at their hands. "Come see. Uncle William says we can project the telescope image so everyone can look at once." Spring arrived in Pine Ridge with remarkable speed, the harsh winter yielding to explosive mountain bloom. The schoolhouse flourished under the joint leadership of Thomas and Mrs. Cooper, with Eleanor now serving as formal assistant 3 days weekly. Her mathematics curriculum had been cautiously approved by the school board after impressive test results from the winter examinations. On weekends, the Grant family often ventured into the surrounding wilderness. Thomas identifying geological formations, Sophie sketching wildflowers, and Eleanor cataloging mathematical patterns in nature. Their intellectual partnership had deepened into genuine love, nurtured by shared discovery and mutual respect. One evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching Venus rise once more, Thomas handed Eleanor an envelope bearing an official Denver postmark. "This arrived today," he said quietly. "I wanted us to open it together." Eleanor recognized the insignia of the Denver Observatory, where Thomas had published his astronomical observations and once been offered a position. "They've invited me to present my latest calculations at their summer symposium," he explained as she read the letter, "and to discuss a potential collaboration on their new stellar mapping project." "Thomas, that's wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed. "Your work is receiving the recognition it deserves." He studied her face carefully. "It would mean occasional travel to Denver, perhaps eventually, if the collaboration proves fruitful, considering a more permanent arrangement there." Eleanor understood the unspoken question, whether she would welcome returning to city life with its greater intellectual opportunities, but increased social constraints. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "that Pine Ridge has taught me the value of building one's own community rather than seeking perfect acceptance in established ones. We could create something meaningful in Denver just as we have here." Relief washed over his features. "You wouldn't regret leaving what we've built here?" "We'd take the most important parts with us," Eleanor replied, glancing toward where Sophie sat with her sketching pad. "Besides, a woman considered too educated for a frontier town might find her perspectives particularly valuable in a growing city with an observatory." Thomas laughed softly. "Indeed, perhaps being too educated simply means being educated for something beyond present circumstances. A perspective I hope will instill in Sophie, and in any additional children with whom we might be blessed," Eleanor added with meaningful emphasis. Thomas's expression shifted to one of joyful question. "Eleanor, are you saying—" She nodded, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "Dr. Mason confirmed it yesterday. By winter, our family will grow by one more scholar." His embrace conveyed everything words could not: gratitude, joy, and the profound contentment of two souls who had found in each other not just acceptance, but celebration of their true selves. The educated bride and the widowed schoolmaster had recognized in each other not just value, but possibility, the chance to build a life where knowledge strengthened love, and where no mind could ever be considered too full of learning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.